In the basement archives of the Montana Historical Society, researcher Dr. Elena Vasquez carefully lifted a faded photograph from its protective sleeve. The image, dated March 15, 1891, showed what appeared to be a typical celebration at the Golden Nugget Saloon in the mining town of Copper Falls, Montana. At first glance, it captured a moment of frontier revelry. Men in their finest suits raising glasses in toast, women in elaborate Victorian dresses laughing at some unheard joke, and the ornate interior of what was clearly one of the territory's more upscale establishments. The photograph had been donated to the Historical Society by the estate of Harold Whitman, a local collector who had spent decades gathering artifacts from Montana's mining boom era. According to the accompanying documentation, the image had been taken during a celebration marking the 5th anniversary of the Golden Nugget's opening, an event that had drawn prominent citizens from across the territory. Elena had been cataloging frontier photography for her doctoral dissertation on social dynamics in 19th-century mining communities when this particular image caught her attention. Something about the composition seemed unusual, though she couldn't immediately identify what was troubling her about the scene. The Golden Nugget had been one of Copper Falls's most prestigious establishments, serving not just as a saloon, but as a social hub for the town's elite. Unlike the rough drinking houses that catered to miners and drifters, the Golden Nugget attracted merchants, mine owners, territorial officials, and their families. The establishment had been known for its elegant furnishings, imported liquors, and regular social events that brought together the most influential people in the region. Eleanor studied the faces in the photograph, noting the careful arrangement of the subjects and the formal poses typical of 1890s photography. In the center of the image stood Marcus Thornfield, the saloon's owner, a distinguished man in his 50s with a carefully waxed mustache and expensive clothing. Around him were arranged various prominent citizens, their names carefully documented in Harold Whitman's notes: Judge Harrison Blackwell, mine owner Samuel Garrett, Territorial Representative William Hayes, and their respective wives and associates. The women in the photograph wore the elaborate bustled dresses fashionable in the early 1890s, their hair arranged in the complex styles of the period. The men sported the formal attire expected of successful frontier businessmen: dark suits, silk vests, and gold watch chains. Everything about the scene spoke of prosperity and respectability, a stark contrast to the rough and tumble image often associated with frontier saloons. But as Elena examined the photograph more closely, she began to notice details that seemed out of place. The expressions on some of the faces appeared forced, as if the subjects were struggling to maintain their smiles. Several people seemed to be looking not at the camera, but at something beyond the photographer's position. Most intriguingly, there appeared to be more people reflected in the large mirror behind the bar than were actually visible in the main composition of the photograph. Elena reached for her magnifying glass and focused on the ornate mirror that dominated the back wall of the saloon. The mirror was a magnificent piece, clearly imported at great expense, with an elaborate gilt frame that spoke to the establishment's pretensions to elegance. In its surface, she could see the reflection of the party guests, but something about the reflection seemed wrong. She counted the figures visible in the main photograph, 23 people arranged in a careful composition for the camera. But in the mirror's reflection, she could make out what appeared to be additional figures, shadowy forms that seemed to be standing among the party guests, but were not visible in the direct view captured by the photographer. Eleanor felt a chill as she realized the implications of what she was seeing. Either the photograph had been somehow manipulated or doctored, which would have been extremely difficult with 1890s technology, or the mirror was reflecting something that the camera's direct view had not captured. She decided to research the history of the Golden Nugget Saloon and the specific event depicted in the photograph. Her investigation led her to the archives of the Copper Falls Gazette, the town's newspaper from the period. What she found there made her increasingly uneasy about the seemingly innocent celebration captured in the image. The first disturbing detail came from an article published just 2 days after the anniversary celebration. The headline read, "Mysterious Illness Strikes Party Guests." According to the report, several attendees at the Golden Nuggets anniversary party had fallen ill with a strange malady that local doctors were unable to diagnose or treat. The symptoms described in the article were unlike anything Elena had encountered in her research on frontier medicine. The affected individuals had reportedly experienced vivid hallucinations, speaking of seeing people who weren't there and insisting that they were being watched by unseen presences. Some had claimed to hear voices calling their names from empty rooms, while others had become convinced that their reflections in mirrors were moving independently of their actions. Most disturbing of all, the article mentioned that 3 of the party guests had died within a week of the celebration, all under circumstances that the local doctor had been unable to explain. The victims had been found in their homes, apparently having died peacefully in their sleep, but with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Elena continued her research, digging deeper into the newspaper archives and local records. What she discovered was a pattern of strange occurrences and unexplained deaths that seemed to center around the Golden Nugget Saloon, particularly in the months following the anniversary celebration. The saloon's owner, Marcus Thornfield, had been found dead in his establishment just 6 weeks after the party. According to the newspaper account, Thornfield had been discovered by his bartender, seated in a chair facing the large mirror behind the bar. The man appeared to have died of natural causes, but witnesses noted that his eyes were wide open and fixed on his own reflection, as if he had been staring at the mirror at the moment of his death. Judge Harrison Blackwell, one of the prominent figures visible in the anniversary photograph, had died under equally mysterious circumstances 3 months later. The judge had been found in his study, slumped over his desk with a letter half written. The unfinished correspondence, which was quoted in the newspaper, contained disturbing references to faces in the glass and the watchers who never leave. Mine owner Samuel Garrett had lasted slightly longer, but his death was perhaps the most unsettling of all. According to the newspaper account, Garrett had become increasingly erratic in the months following the party, claiming that he was being followed by people who appeared only in reflections. He had ordered all the mirrors in his house to be covered or removed, but had still insisted that he could see threatening figures in any reflective surface, including windows, polished metal, and even standing water. Garrett's death had occurred when he had apparently thrown himself from the window of his second-story office, but witnesses reported that just before his fatal leap, he had been seen arguing with someone in his office, though no one else was present in the room at the time. Elena realized that she was looking at a pattern of deaths that defied rational explanation. The victims had all been present at the Golden Nugget's anniversary celebration, and they had all died under circumstances involving mirrors, reflections, or claims of seeing people who weren't there. She decided to research the history of the Golden Nugget Saloon itself, hoping to understand why the establishment might have been the focal point for such strange occurrences. What she discovered was a story that stretched back to the earliest days of Copper Falls and involved events that the town's respectable citizens had apparently tried very hard to forget. The Golden Nugget had been built in 1886 on the site of an earlier establishment called Murphy's Tavern, a rough drinking house that had catered to miners and transients. Murphy's Tavern had burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1885, killing 7 people who had been trapped inside when the building's exits had somehow become blocked during the fire. The official investigation into the fire had concluded that it was an accident caused by an overturned oil lamp, but Elena found references in private letters and diaries that suggested a more sinister explanation. According to these accounts, Murphy's Tavern had been the site of illegal gambling operations and other criminal activities, and several witnesses had claimed that the fire had been deliberately set to eliminate evidence and silence potential informants. Most intriguingly, Elena discovered that the large mirror that dominated the Golden Nugget's back wall had not been purchased new for the upscale establishment. According to the record she found, the mirror had been salvaged from Murphy's Tavern after the fire, apparently the only item to survive the blaze completely undamaged. The mirror had been an unusual piece even when it was first installed in Murphy's Tavern. According to a newspaper article from 1884, the mirror had been acquired by the tavern's owner, Patrick Murphy, from a traveling merchant who claimed it had come from a mansion in New Orleans. The merchant had been eager to sell the piece quickly and had accepted far less than its apparent value, claiming that he needed to be rid of the cursed thing as soon as possible. Elena found this detail particularly intriguing, especially given the merchant's apparent urgency to dispose of the mirror. She decided to research the piece's history before it arrived in Montana, hoping to understand why someone would consider an ornate mirror to be cursed. Her investigation led her to contact Dr. Marie Dubois, a professor of Southern history at Tulane University, who specialized in 19th-century New Orleans. Dr. Dubois was immediately interested in Elena's description of the mirror and its apparent connection to mysterious deaths. Mirrors from antebellum New Orleans often have very dark histories, Dr. Dubois explained during their phone conversation. Many of the grand mansions in the city were built with wealth derived from the slave trade and other morally questionable activities. There are numerous accounts of mirrors and other reflective objects being associated with supernatural phenomena, particularly in houses where violent or traumatic events had occurred. Dr. Dubois went on to describe a specific case that seemed to match Elena's mirror. There was a mansion in the Garden District that belonged to a family named Beauregard. The house was known for its magnificent furnishings, including a large mirror that was said to show more than just reflections. According to local accounts, people who looked into the mirror would sometimes see figures that weren't actually present in the room, and several deaths in the house were attributed to the mirror's malevolent influence. The professor explained that the Beauregard mansion had been abandoned in the 1870s, after a series of mysterious deaths had driven the family away. The house had eventually been demolished, but many of its furnishings had been sold to dealers who had dispersed them throughout the country. The Beauregard family had made their fortune in the sugar trade, which meant they were heavily involved in the slave economy, Dr. Dubois continued. The mansion was built in 1847 by Armand Beauregard, who was known for his particularly cruel treatment of enslaved people. According to historical records, at least 12 enslaved individuals died on the property under suspicious circumstances, and many more suffered severe abuse. Dr. Dubois explained that the mirror in question had been installed in the mansion's main parlor, where Beauregard had conducted business and entertained guests. The parlor was also where Beauregard would bring enslaved people to be punished or sold, she said. According to accounts from the period, the mirror was positioned so that it reflected the entire room, meaning it would have witnessed countless acts of cruelty and human suffering. The professor went on to describe the specific incidents that had led to the mansion's abandonment. The first strange occurrence was reported in 1871 when Armand Beauregard's son, Claude, claimed to see figures in the mirror that weren't present in the room. Claude described seeing enslaved people in chains, reaching out toward him with expressions of anger and accusation. His family initially dismissed these claims as the result of guilt over the family's involvement in slavery, but the sightings continued and became more frequent. Dr. Dubois explained that other family members had soon begun experiencing similar phenomena. Claude's wife Marie reported seeing a woman in the mirror who appeared to be holding a baby, both of them showing signs of severe illness. Marie became convinced that the woman was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't understand what the spirit wanted. The situation had deteriorated rapidly after that. Within 6 months, 3 members of the Beauregard family had died under mysterious circumstances, Dr. Dubois said. Claude was found dead in the parlor, seated in front of the mirror with his eyes wide open, as if he had been staring at his reflection when he died. His wife Marie died a month later, apparently from a sudden illness that doctors couldn't diagnose. Their young daughter Celeste was found drowned in a fountain in the mansion's courtyard, despite being an excellent swimmer. The surviving family members had fled the mansion immediately after Celeste's death, leaving behind most of their possessions. The house stood empty for several years before being demolished, Dr. Dubois explained. Most of the furnishings were sold at auction, and many of them were dispersed throughout the country. It's quite possible that your mirror is the same one from the Beauregard parlor. Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease as she considered the implications of Dr. Dubois' information. If the mirror in the Golden Nugget had indeed come from a house with such a dark history of slavery and abuse, it might explain the supernatural phenomena that had occurred in Copper Falls. She decided to research the connection between the Beauregard mansion and Murphy's Tavern more thoroughly. Her investigation revealed that Patrick Murphy, the original owner of the tavern in Copper Falls, had indeed spent time in New Orleans during the 1870s, working as a dealer in second-hand furnishings and estate goods. According to records Elena found in the New Orleans City Archives, Murphy had been present at the auction of the Beauregard estate in 1878. He had purchased several items, including the large mirror, and had shipped them to Montana where he planned to use them to furnish his tavern. The records indicated that Murphy had gotten the mirror for a remarkably low price, suggesting that other bidders had been reluctant to purchase it. Elena also discovered that Murphy had not been the only person to experience strange phenomena associated with items from the Beauregard estate. Several other purchasers had reported unusual occurrences after acquiring furnishings from the mansion, and at least 3 had returned their purchases to the auction house, claiming that the items were haunted or cursed. The more Eleanor learned about the mirror's history, the more convinced she became that it was somehow connected to the supernatural events that had plagued Copper Falls. The mirror had apparently witnessed decades of human suffering, first in the Beauregard mansion and then in Murphy's tavern, and it seemed to have retained some kind of spiritual imprint of those traumatic experiences. Eleanor decided to examine the 1891 photograph more closely, using high-resolution scanning equipment to enhance the details visible in the mirror's reflection. What she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about the nature of photography and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The enhanced scans revealed that the additional figures visible in the mirror's reflection were not simply photographic artifacts or tricks of light and shadow. They appeared to be actual people, but their clothing and appearance were distinctly different from that of the party guests. Some of the reflected figures wore the simple, rough garments of enslaved people from the antebellum South, while others were dressed in the working clothes of 19th-century laborers. Most disturbing of all, several of the reflected figures appeared to be showing signs of injury or distress. One figure seemed to have shackles around his wrists, while another appeared to be a woman holding what looked like a small child. A third figure was barely visible, appearing more as a shadow than a solid form, but seemed to be reaching out toward the party guests with an expression of desperate urgency. Elena realized that she might be looking at the reflections of people who had suffered and died in connection with the mirror's dark history. If the mirror had somehow retained images of traumatic events that had occurred in its presence, it might be showing the spirits of enslaved people who had been abused in the Beauregard mansion, as well as the victims of the fire at Murphy's tavern. But this raised even more disturbing questions about the nature of the anniversary celebration and the subsequent deaths of the party guests. If the mirror was indeed showing the spirits of the dead, what did their presence at the party mean? Were they trying to communicate with the living, or were they seeking some form of justice against those who had built their prosperity on the suffering of others? Elena decided to research the backgrounds of the people who had attended the anniversary party, hoping to understand why they might have been targeted by supernatural forces. What she discovered was a web of connections that linked many of the party guests to systems of exploitation and injustice that stretched back decades. Marcus Thornfield, the owner of the Golden Nugget, had made his fortune through investments in mining operations that relied heavily on immigrant labor, working under dangerous conditions. Judge Harrison Blackwell had a history of ruling in favor of mine owners in disputes with workers, even when the evidence clearly showed that safety violations had caused injuries or deaths. Mine owner Samuel Garrett had been known for paying substandard wages and maintaining unsafe working conditions in his operations. Elena began to see a pattern emerging from her research. Many of the people who had attended the anniversary celebration had been involved in perpetuating systems of exploitation and injustice, either directly through their business practices or indirectly through their positions of authority. The mysterious deaths that had followed the party seemed to be a form of supernatural justice, with the spirits of those who had been wronged claiming retribution against their oppressors. But the most disturbing aspect of Elena's investigation was the realization that the supernatural activity associated with the mirror had not ended with the deaths of the party guests. According to the records she found, strange occurrences had continued to plague the Golden Nugget for years after the anniversary celebration. Employees of the saloon had reported seeing figures in the mirror that weren't present in the room, hearing voices calling from empty spaces, and experiencing the sensation of being watched by unseen presences. Several bartenders had quit their positions, claiming that they felt uncomfortable working in the establishment, particularly during the evening hours when the mirror seemed to become more active. One particularly detailed account came from a bartender named Thomas O'Malley, who had worked at the Golden Nugget from 1892 to 1894. In a letter to his brother in Ireland, which Elena found in a collection of immigrant correspondence, O'Malley described his experiences with the haunted mirror in vivid detail. "The mirror behind the bar is not natural," O'Malley had written. "During the day it seems ordinary enough, but as evening approaches and the shadows grow long, it begins to show things that are not there. I have seen figures of men, women, and children in chains, their faces filled with sorrow and anger. Sometimes they seem to be trying to speak, but no sound comes from the glass. Other times they appear to be reaching out, as if they are trying to escape from whatever realm they inhabit." O'Malley's letter went on to describe specific incidents that had convinced him to leave his position at the saloon. "Last Tuesday evening, as I was cleaning glasses behind the bar, I saw in the mirror the reflection of a woman holding a baby. Both appeared to be ill, and the woman was looking directly at me with such sadness in her eyes that I felt compelled to turn around. But when I did, there was no one there." The main room of the saloon was empty, except for 2 customers playing cards at a corner table. The bartender had also reported hearing voices coming from the direction of the mirror, particularly during the late evening hours when the saloon was nearly empty. "The voices speak in languages I do not recognize, but their tone is unmistakable. They are pleading, crying out for justice or mercy. Sometimes I hear the sound of chains rattling, or the cries of children calling for their mothers. It is enough to drive a man to madness." O'Malley's letter concluded with a warning that Elena found particularly chilling. "I have decided to leave this place and seek employment elsewhere. The mirror holds too much pain and anger, and I fear that those who work near it for too long will be drawn into whatever dark realm it reflects. I have already begun to see the figures in other mirrors around town, and I worry that they are following me. I pray that distance will break whatever connection has been formed." Elena discovered that O'Malley's fears had been well-founded. According to records she found in the Irish-American community archives, the former bartender had died just 6 months after leaving Copper Falls, found dead in his new home in Butte, with no apparent cause of death. Witnesses reported that he had been found seated in front of a mirror, with the same expression of terror that had characterized the deaths of the anniversary party guests. Elena also found accounts from other employees who had worked at the Golden Nugget during the years following the anniversary celebration. A server named Catherine Walsh had written to her sister in Boston describing similar experiences with the mirror, including sightings of ghostly children who appeared to be reaching out for help. "The children in the mirror break my heart," Walsh had written. "They appear to be no more than 8 or 10 years old, and they look so frightened and alone. Sometimes I see them holding hands, as if they are trying to comfort each other. I have tried speaking to them, but they cannot seem to hear me. I fear they are trapped in some terrible place between life and death." Walsh's letter also described encounters with adult figures in the mirror who appeared to be protecting the children. "There is a woman who often appears with the little ones. She seems to be their mother or caretaker, and she watches over them with such fierce love. But her face is filled with rage when she looks at the customers in the saloon, as if she blames them for some terrible wrong." The server had eventually left her position at the Golden Nugget after experiencing what she described as a direct communication with the spirits in the mirror. "Last night, as I was cleaning tables near the bar, I heard a voice calling my name. When I looked up, I saw the woman in the mirror pointing at something behind me. I turned around and saw one of the customers, Mr. Garrett, reaching into his coat as if he were drawing a weapon. I screamed and ran from the room, and when I returned with help, we found Mr. Garrett collapsed on the floor, apparently having suffered some kind of seizure." Eleanor realized that this incident might have been connected to Samuel Garrett's eventual death, and that the spirits in the mirror might have been trying to protect the innocent employees of the saloon from the supernatural retribution that was being visited upon the party guests. The Golden Nugget had eventually closed in 1895, just 4 years after the anniversary celebration. The official reason given was economic difficulties, but Elena found private correspondence that suggested the real cause was the establishment's reputation for supernatural activity. Customers had become reluctant to patronize a business that was rumored to be haunted, and employees had become increasingly difficult to retain. After the saloon closed, the building had been sold and converted into a boarding house, but the strange occurrences had continued. Tenants had reported seeing figures in the mirror that moved independently of their own reflections, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, and experiencing vivid nightmares that seemed to involve scenes of slavery and abuse. Elena found a particularly disturbing account from a boarding house tenant named Margaret Sullivan, who had rented a room on the second floor in 1897. In a letter to her sister, Sullivan described experiences that seemed to directly connect the mirror to the suffering of enslaved people in the antebellum South. "The mirror in the main parlor downstairs shows the most terrible things," Sullivan had written. "I have seen reflected in it scenes of cruelty that I cannot bear to describe in detail. Men, women, and children in chains, being beaten and abused by their masters. Families being torn apart, with children sold away from their parents. The suffering in their faces is beyond anything I have ever witnessed." Sullivan's letter went on to describe how the supernatural activity had affected her own life. "I have begun to have dreams about these poor souls, and in my dreams they speak to me. They tell me their names and the stories of their lives and deaths. They beg me to remember them, to tell others about their suffering. But who would believe such a tale? Who would care about the pain of people who died decades ago in a distant place?" The boarding house tenant had also reported that the supernatural activity seemed to intensify during certain times of the year. "The spirits appear most frequently during the winter months, particularly around Christmas time. I believe this is because that was when slave families were most often separated, as masters would sell their human property to settle debts or make holiday purchases. The pain of those separations seems to echo through time, manifesting in the mirror's reflections." Sullivan had eventually moved out of the boarding house after experiencing what she described as a vision of the future in the mirror. "I saw myself as an old woman, still haunted by the spirits I had encountered. They were following me, trying to tell their stories through me, but I was too frightened to listen. I realized that I had to leave this place or risk being consumed by their pain and anger." The boarding house had eventually been abandoned in 1902, and the building had stood empty for several years before being demolished in 1908. According to the records Eleanor found, the large mirror had been removed from the building before its demolition and had been sold to a private collector, but its subsequent whereabouts were unknown. Eleanor realized that the mirror might still exist somewhere, potentially continuing to cause supernatural disturbances wherever it had been installed. The thought that such a dangerous artifact might still be affecting innocent people was deeply troubling, and she decided to try to trace its movements after it left Copper Falls. Her investigation led her to contact antique dealers and collectors throughout the region, hoping to find some trace of the mirror's path after 1908. Most of her inquiries yielded no results, but one dealer in Helena, Montana, provided information that made Elena's blood run cold. According to the dealer, a mirror matching the description of the golden nugget piece had been sold at an estate auction in 1912. The mirror had been purchased by a wealthy family in Billings, but had been returned to the auction house just 6 months later, after the family had experienced what they described as disturbing supernatural phenomena. The auction house had then sold the mirror to a hotel in Missoula, but it had been returned again within a year, after guests had complained about strange occurrences in rooms where the mirror was visible. The pattern had continued for several decades, with the mirror being sold and returned repeatedly as each new owner discovered its unsettling properties. Eleanor learned that the mirror had changed hands more than 20 times between 1912 and 1967, with each ownership lasting only a few months to a few years before the piece was returned or resold. The reasons given were remarkably consistent: supernatural phenomena, unexplained deaths, and the appearance of figures in the mirror that weren't present in the room. One particularly detailed account came from the records of the Riverside Hotel in Great Falls, which had purchased the mirror in 1934. According to the hotel manager's notes, guests in rooms where the mirror was visible had complained about seeing figures from another time reflected in the glass. Several guests had checked out early, claiming that they felt threatened by the apparitions. The situation had escalated when a guest named Robert Chen, a traveling salesman from California, had been found dead in his room after apparently staring at the mirror for hours. Chen had been discovered by housekeeping staff, seated in a chair facing the mirror with his eyes wide open and an expression of terror on his face. The local coroner had been unable to determine a cause of death, ruling it as sudden cardiac arrest of unknown origin. The hotel had removed the mirror immediately after Chen's death, selling it to a private collector who had assured them that he was aware of its unusual properties and was prepared to deal with any supernatural phenomena. Elena found it particularly disturbing that Chen shared a surname with one of the figures she had identified in the mirror's reflections, suggesting that the supernatural forces associated with the artifact might be targeting people with connections to its dark history. Eleanor also discovered records of other incidents involving the mirror during its journey from owner to owner. In 1923, a family in Bozeman had reported that their young daughter had begun speaking in what appeared to be a foreign language after spending time in a room where the mirror was displayed. The child had claimed that she was talking to the sad people in the glass and had described conversations with individuals who matched the descriptions of enslaved people from the antebellum South. In 1941, a collector in Kalispell had documented his experiences with the mirror in a detailed journal that Elena was able to access through the collector's estate. The man had described seeing historical scenes playing out in the mirror's reflection, including what appeared to be slave auctions, plantation punishments, and family separations. "The mirror seems to be a window into the past," the collector had written, "but it is not a passive window. The figures I see in it are aware of my presence, and they seem to be trying to communicate with me. They point to things in the reflection that I cannot see directly, and their expressions suggest that they are trying to warn me about something." The collector had also noted that the supernatural activity associated with the mirror seemed to affect other objects in his house. "Clocks stop working when they are placed near the mirror," he had written. "Photographs fade or develop strange shadows when they are hung on the same wall. Most disturbing of all, other mirrors in the house have begun to show reflections that do not match what is actually in the room." The collector had eventually donated the mirror to a local museum, but it had been returned within a month after staff members had reported feeling overwhelmed by sadness when working near the artifact. The museum director had noted in his correspondence that several employees had experienced vivid dreams about slavery and abuse after encountering the mirror, and that one staff member had suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. The dealer's records indicated that the mirror had last been sold in 1967 to a private collector in Bozeman, but attempts to contact the collector had been unsuccessful. Elena realized that the mirror might still be in someone's possession, potentially continuing to cause supernatural disturbances more than a century after the fire at Murphy's Tavern. She decided to travel to Bozeman to investigate the mirror's last known location, hoping to either find the artifact or determine what had happened to it. The drive to Bozeman took her through the same mountainous terrain that 19th century travelers had navigated, and she found herself thinking about the people in the anniversary photograph and the tragic events that had followed their celebration. In Bozeman, Elena was able to locate the address where the mirror had last been delivered in 1967. The house was a large Victorian mansion that had been converted into apartments, and the current owner was able to provide her with information about the previous residents. According to the owner, the collector who had purchased the mirror in 1967 was a man named Robert Ashford, an elderly antique enthusiast who had lived alone in the mansion until his death in 1983. Ashford had been found dead in his study, seated in a chair facing a large mirror, in circumstances that were remarkably similar to the deaths that had been associated with the artifact for nearly a century. The current owner also mentioned that Ashford had been known in the community as something of an eccentric, claiming to have conversations with historical figures who appeared to him in his antique mirrors. "He used to tell people that his mirrors were windows into the past," the owner said. "Most folks thought he was just a harmless old man with an overactive imagination, but after he died, some strange things started happening in the house." Elena learned that after Ashford's death, his estate had been sold, and most of his antique collection had been dispersed through various auction houses. The current owner of the mansion had purchased the property from Ashford's estate, but had not acquired any of the furnishings that had been in the house at the time of the collector's death. Elena was able to obtain contact information for the auction house that had handled Ashford's estate, and her inquiry there led to another disturbing discovery. According to the auction house records, the large mirror from Ashford's study had been purchased by a family in Great Falls, Montana, but had been returned just 3 weeks later after the buyers had experienced what they described as terrifying supernatural activity. The mirror had then been sold to a hotel in Kalispell, but had been returned again within 6 months. The pattern that had begun in the early 1900s was apparently continuing into the modern era, with the mirror being passed from owner to owner as each discovered its malevolent properties. The auction house manager was able to provide Elena with the mirror's most recent sale information. According to their records, the piece had been purchased in 2018 by a bed and breakfast owner in Whitefish, Montana, who had been looking for period furnishings to enhance the historic atmosphere of her establishment. Elena felt a sense of urgency as she realized that the mirror might currently be in use at a business where unsuspecting guests could be exposed to its supernatural influence. She immediately called the bed and breakfast to inquire about the mirror and was relieved when the owner, Sarah Mitchell, agreed to speak with her about the piece. "Oh, that mirror," Sarah said when Elena described the artifact. "We had to remove it from the guest rooms after just a few months. Guests kept complaining about seeing things in it that weren't really there, and several people checked out early because they felt uncomfortable. We moved it to storage in the basement, and honestly, I've been meaning to get rid of it but haven't gotten around to it." Elena explained her research and the mirror's history, and Sarah was shocked to learn about the artifact's connection to mysterious deaths and supernatural phenomena. "I had no idea it had such a dark history," Sarah said. "I just thought it was a beautiful antique piece. But now that you mention it, even in storage, sometimes I hear strange sounds coming from the basement, and my cleaning staff has complained about feeling like they're being watched when they go down there." Sarah went on to describe some of the specific incidents that had led to the mirror's removal from the guest rooms. One guest, an elderly woman from California, claimed that she saw children in the mirror who were crying and reaching out to her. She said they appeared to be asking for help, but she couldn't understand what they wanted. Another guest, a businessman from Seattle, reported seeing figures in chains who seemed to be pointing at him accusingly. The bed and breakfast owner also mentioned that some guests had reported experiencing vivid dreams after staying in rooms where the mirror had been visible. They described dreams about slavery and abuse, which was strange because most of our guests come here for relaxation and outdoor activities. One woman said she dreamed about being separated from her children and sold at auction, even though she had no personal connection to that history. Elena asked if she could examine the mirror, and Sarah readily agreed, eager to have an expert assess the piece and hopefully find a way to safely dispose of it. The next day, Elena drove to Whitefish and met Sarah at the bed and breakfast, a charming Victorian house that had been lovingly restored to its 19th century elegance. Sarah led Elena to the basement, where the mirror was stored among other unused furnishings and seasonal decorations. Even covered with a dusty sheet, the mirror was an imposing presence, its ornate gilt frame catching what little light filtered into the storage area. When Sarah pulled away the sheet, Elena felt an immediate sense of unease. The mirror was exactly as it had appeared in the 1891 photograph, its elaborate frame and silvered surface apparently unchanged by more than a century of use. But as Elena looked into the mirror, she experienced something that made her step back in alarm. For just a moment, she thought she saw additional figures reflected in the mirror's surface, shadowy forms that seemed to be standing behind her, even though she and Sarah were the only people in the basement. The figures appeared to be wearing the clothing of different eras, some in the simple garments of enslaved people, others in the work clothes of 19th century laborers, and still others in the formal attire of the 1890s. Elena blinked and looked again, but the strange reflections were gone, showing only her own image and Sarah's standing in the basement storage area. But the brief glimpse had been enough to convince her that the mirror was indeed the same artifact that had caused so much tragedy and supernatural disturbance over the past century and a half. "We need to find a way to safely dispose of this mirror," Elena told Sarah. "Based on my research, it's been associated with mysterious deaths and supernatural phenomena for more than 150 years. It's not safe to keep it, even in storage." Sarah was eager to be rid of the mirror, but Elena realized that simply selling it or giving it away would only pass the problem on to another unsuspecting victim. She needed to find a way to permanently neutralize the mirror's supernatural properties or ensure that it could never again harm innocent people. Elena decided to consult with experts in paranormal research and Native American spiritual traditions, hoping to find someone who might know how to safely deal with such a dangerous artifact. Her inquiries led her to Dr. James Crow Dog, a professor of Native American Studies at the University of Montana, who also served as a spiritual advisor to several tribal communities. Dr. Crow Dog was immediately interested in Elena's description of the mirror and its history. "What you're describing sounds like what our people would call a spirit trap," he explained. Certain objects, particularly those that have been present during traumatic events, can become repositories for spiritual energy. Mirrors are especially susceptible to this because they exist at the boundary between the physical world and the realm of reflections, which many cultures consider to be connected to the spirit world. The professor went on to explain that Native American traditions included ceremonies for cleansing such objects and releasing any spirits that might be trapped within them. The key is to acknowledge the suffering that has occurred and to help the trapped spirits find peace, he said. Simply destroying the object might not be enough, because the spiritual energy could transfer to other items or locations. Dr. Crow Dog offered to perform a cleansing ceremony for the mirror, but he warned that such rituals could be dangerous and should only be attempted by someone with proper training and spiritual protection. He also emphasized that the ceremony would need to be performed with respect for all the spirits involved, including those who had been wronged and those who had committed the wrongs. Elena arranged for Dr. Crow Dog to travel to Whitefish to examine the mirror and determine what type of ceremony might be needed. When he arrived at the bed and breakfast, he spent several minutes studying the mirror without speaking, occasionally making gestures that Elena didn't recognize, but that seemed to be part of some spiritual assessment. "This mirror contains great pain and anger," Dr. Crow Dog finally said. "I can sense the presence of multiple spirits, some who died violently, and others who were complicit in covering up injustice. The mirror has become a focal point for unresolved conflict between these different spiritual energies." The professor explained that the cleansing ceremony would need to address not just the trapped spirits of those who had suffered, but also the guilt and fear of those who had profited from injustice. "All the spirits need to find peace," he said. "The victims need acknowledgement of their suffering and justice for the wrongs done to them, while those who wronged them need forgiveness and release from their guilt." Dr. Crow Dog spent the next day preparing for the ceremony, gathering sacred herbs and other materials that would be needed for the ritual. He also asked Elena and Sarah to research the names of all the people who had suffered in connection with the mirror's history, explaining that the spirits needed to be acknowledged by name in order for the ceremony to be effective. Elena was able to compile a comprehensive list that included the enslaved people who had died at the Beauregard mansion, the 7 victims of the fire at Murphy's Tavern, and the various individuals who had died under mysterious circumstances after encountering the mirror over the decades. She also researched the names of those who had perpetrated injustices, including Armand Beauregard and the members of Copper Falls Society who had profited from systems of exploitation. The research process itself proved to be emotionally challenging for Elena, as she uncovered detailed accounts of the suffering that had occurred in connection with the mirror. She found records of enslaved families that had been separated, children who had been sold away from their parents, and individuals who had died under brutal conditions on the Beauregard plantation. One particularly heartbreaking account came from the diary of a plantation overseer, which Elena found in the Louisiana State Archives. The overseer had documented the deaths of several enslaved people, including a woman named Sarah and her infant son, who had died of illness after being denied medical care. The overseer's diary indicated that Sarah had been forced to continue working even while sick, and that she had died while being punished for her inability to complete her assigned tasks. Elena also found records of the fire victims at Murphy's Tavern, including detailed accounts of their final moments. The 7 people who had died in the blaze had included Patrick Murphy himself, as well as several customers who had been trapped when the exits became blocked. Witness accounts suggested that some of the victims had survived the initial fire, but had been overcome by smoke while trying to escape through windows that had been barred to prevent theft. Among the victims was a Chinese immigrant named Li Wei, who had been working as a cook at the tavern. According to witness accounts, Li Wei had tried to help other customers escape through the kitchen, but had been trapped when part of the ceiling collapsed. His body had been found near the back door, suggesting that he had died while trying to save others. Another victim was a young woman named Maria Santos, who had been serving customers when the fire started. Witnesses reported that Maria had been helping elderly patrons evacuate when she was overcome by smoke. Her body had been found near the front entrance, where she had apparently collapsed while trying to reach safety. The cleansing ceremony took place on a clear evening in late autumn, with Dr. Crow Dog leading the ritual, while Elena and Sarah participated as witnesses. The professor began by burning sacred herbs, and offering prayers in his native language, calling upon spiritual forces to assist in the healing process. As the ceremony progressed, Eleanor began to notice changes in the mirror's appearance. The surface seemed to shimmer and fluctuate, as if the silvered backing were moving like water. Occasionally she thought she could see shadowy figures appearing and disappearing in the reflection, but they no longer seemed threatening or angry. Dr. Crow Dog spoke the names of each person who had suffered in connection with the mirror's history, acknowledging their pain and asking for their spirits to find peace. He then spoke the names of those who had perpetrated injustices, asking for forgiveness for any wrongs they had committed, and requesting that their spirits also be released from the cycle of guilt and retribution. As the ceremony reached its climax, Eleanor experienced something that she would never forget. The mirror's surface suddenly became perfectly clear, showing not reflections, but what appeared to be an actual window into another realm. She could see figures moving in a space that seemed to exist beyond the physical world, and for a moment she thought she recognized some of the faces from the 1891 photograph, as well as others from different time periods. The figures appeared to be at peace, no longer showing the expressions of anger, fear, or desperation that had characterized their appearances in the mirror's reflections. They seemed to be moving away from the mirror, walking toward a light that grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire surface. Among the figures, Eleanor thought she could see Sarah and her infant son, the enslaved woman and child who had died on the Beauregard plantation. They were holding hands and walking together toward the light, their faces showing expressions of relief and joy. She also saw what appeared to be the fire victims from Murphy's Tavern, including Patrick Murphy himself, Lee Way, and Maria Santos, who seemed to be walking together as a group toward whatever peaceful realm awaited them. Most remarkably, Elena could see figures from the 1891 anniversary party walking alongside the victims, no longer as oppressors, but as fellow souls seeking redemption and peace. Marcus Thornfield, Judge Blackwell, and Samuel Garrett appeared to be walking hand in hand with some of the people they had wronged in life, their faces showing expressions of understanding and reconciliation. Then, suddenly, the mirror returned to normal, showing only the reflection of Eleanor, Sarah, and Dr. Crow Dog standing in the basement. But something fundamental had changed about the artifact. The oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded it was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and resolution. Dr. Crow Dog concluded the ceremony by offering final prayers of gratitude and protection, then carefully covered the mirror with a clean white cloth. "The spirits have been released," he said quietly. "They have found the peace that was denied to them for so long." The mirror should no longer be a source of supernatural disturbance, but it would be wise to treat it with continued respect. Eleanor and Sarah decided that the mirror should be donated to a museum where it could be properly preserved and displayed with information about its history and the ceremony that had cleansed it. The Montana Historical Society was eager to acquire such a significant artifact, and Elena worked with the museum's curators to create an exhibition that would tell the complete story of the mirror and the events it had witnessed. The exhibition, titled Reflections of the Past, A Mirror's Journey Through American History, opened 6 months later and became one of the museum's most popular displays. Visitors were fascinated by the story of the mirror and the supernatural phenomena associated with it, and many commented on the sense of peace and resolution that seemed to emanate from the artifact. The exhibition included detailed information about the history of slavery in the antebellum South, the exploitation of immigrant workers in the American West, and the importance of acknowledging historical injustices. Elena worked with historians, civil rights organizations, and Native American communities to ensure that the display was both educational and respectful to all those whose stories were represented. Elena's research into the mirror and its history led to the publication of several academic papers and a book that became a seminal work in the field of paranormal historical research. Her careful documentation of the supernatural phenomena and the successful cleansing ceremony provided valuable insights into the ways that traumatic historical events can leave lasting spiritual impressions and how traditional healing practices can address such disturbances. The 1891 photograph of the anniversary party at the Golden Nugget Saloon was displayed alongside the mirror, with detailed explanations of the additional figures visible in the reflection and their connection to the mirror's dark history. The exhibition served as both a historical record and a reminder of the importance of acknowledging past wrongs and seeking healing for all those affected by injustice and exploitation. Elena continued her work as a historical researcher, but the experience with the mirror had changed her perspective on the nature of historical investigation. She had learned that some artifacts carry with them not just information about the past, but actual spiritual connections to the people and events they represent, and that studying such objects requires not just academic rigor, but also cultural sensitivity and spiritual awareness. The story of the mirror and the spirits it had contained became a powerful reminder of the importance of treating all historical artifacts with respect and understanding, recognizing that they may carry with them not just information about the past, but actual pieces of the human experience that deserve to be honored and preserved for future generations. Elena's work also led to the establishment of new protocols for handling potentially supernatural artifacts in museums and historical collections. Her collaboration with Dr. Crow Dog resulted in the development of guidelines that combined Western academic standards with traditional Native American spiritual practices, creating a more holistic approach to historical preservation that honored both scientific inquiry and cultural wisdom. The success of the Mirror exhibition led to increased interest in other potentially supernatural artifacts in the Montana Historical Society's collection. Elena was asked to examine several other items that had been associated with unexplained phenomena, including a music box that reportedly played melodies on its own, and a photograph that seemed to show different images depending on who was looking at it. Each investigation reinforced Elena's belief that historical artifacts could serve as conduits for spiritual energy, particularly when they had been present during traumatic or emotionally significant events. Her work contributed to a growing field of study that combined historical research with paranormal investigation, attracting scholars from disciplines ranging from anthropology to psychology. The Mirror exhibition also became a model for other museums dealing with artifacts that had dark or controversial histories. Elena was invited to consult on exhibitions about slavery, genocide, and other traumatic historical events, helping museums find ways to present difficult subjects with appropriate sensitivity and respect for all those affected. One particularly significant project involved working with the National Museum of African American History and Culture to develop protocols for handling artifacts related to slavery and the slave trade. Elena's experience with the Beauregard mirror provided valuable insights into how such objects might retain spiritual energy and how that energy could be addressed through appropriate ceremonies and acknowledgement. Years later, Eleanor would often think about the 1891 photograph and the moment when she first noticed the additional figures in the mirror's reflection. What had appeared to be a harmless party scene had revealed itself to be a window into a world of suffering, injustice, and supernatural mystery, but also a testament to the power of acknowledgement, forgiveness, and traditional wisdom to bring peace to troubled spirits and closure to unfinished stories from the past. The mirror now rests peacefully in the Montana Historical Society, its dark history acknowledged and its spiritual burdens lifted. Visitors often comment on the sense of calm that surrounds the artifact, and some claim to see faint, peaceful figures in its reflection, but these sightings are described as comforting rather than frightening, suggesting that the spirits have indeed found the peace they were seeking for more than a century and a half. The 1891 saloon party, that had looked so harmless at first glance, had ultimately revealed the complex relationships between the living and the dead, between past and present, and between justice and forgiveness. The figures in the mirror had finally been seen, acknowledged, and honored, transforming a source of supernatural terror into a beacon of healing and understanding that continues to educate and inspire visitors from around the world. The legacy of Elena's work extends far beyond the single mirror and photograph that started her investigation. Her research has helped establish new standards for ethical historical research that takes into account not just the factual accuracy of historical accounts, but also the spiritual and emotional impact of traumatic events on communities and individuals. Her work has shown that the past is not simply a collection of facts and dates, but a living reality that continues to influence the present in ways both seen and unseen.